Get to the bottom of what's truly healthy in this crazy, complex world, so you can take back what is rightfully yours. Welcome to the Health Sovereign Podcast. This is your host, Logan Christopher.
We continue our conversation with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. If you missed the previous episode, there you can find the topics of metabolic flexibility and fasting. And now we dive into stress, adaptability, and heart rate variability right after a short commercial break. Forget fads. How about you base your health on sound principles that have existed for millennia? That's what my book, Powered by Nature, How Nature Improves Our Health, Happiness, and Performance is all about. If you want a special deal, my company Lost Empire Herbs will give you a $30 gift card to buy a $20 book. Plus, every sale will support indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest too. Find out more and pick up your copy at poweredbynaturebbook.com. So I want to shift gears a bit into talking about like stress and heart rate variability, which is something you're quite big on. I believe you did some research papers on that. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So for people that are not familiar with heart rate variability, how would you explain that?
Yeah. So heart rate variability is a non-invasive way to get a marker of stress on your nervous system. So most people are familiar with what the average heart rate is. And if you poll most people, they would say, hey, your heart rate at rest should be just like a metronome, right? So very little to no variability. And what we find in research is that's actually very bad. Yeah. There was a Chinese proverb that said that if your heart beats like a metronome, your days you have left to live are limited or something like that. So even hundreds of years ago, they've kind of known that this is a thing. And you can go back in time to Galen was one of the early physicians that looked at, variability in heartbeats when listening to, people he took care of and all sorts of stuff. But it wasn't until probably about the 60s that we were able to have equipment to actually measure it. So initially, HRV was used to measure the status of the Russian cosmonauts. So when they started putting them up in space, they're like, oh, how do we know if they're going to be healthy? Or how do we know if something goes wrong? Because the communication, the radio waves were very, very limited on the amount of data that they could move back and forth. So what they did is they found this heart rate variability and found a way to actually measure it. So they would have the cosmonauts do a little heart rate strap, and they would send back literally like 3 to 4 bits of data, one right after the other, which is called the RR intervals. And then they would process that basically back in Moscow or wherever they're monitoring them. And they would translate that into their heart rate variability score, which would then give them a marker of how much stress they were under. And that very similar methodology is still used now. When I started doing research on it, it was probably almost like 10, 12 years ago. The equipment we bought used was probably like 12 to 20 grand. It was in the tens of thousands of dollars. And you had to come into the lab. And I had to write this still silly MATLAB program to transfer this and to take it and drop it into Cubios and do all this monkey motion to get the numbers out of it to process it. So it's kind of a pain in the ass. But it's starting about 7 years ago, they had phone apps that would start to do this. So via your smartphone now, it's like a microprocessor in your pocket. And there's many of those programs now. You can literally wake up in the morning, put on a little heart rate strap or some type of finger sensor. It'll take 60 seconds from the case of like the iThlete to measure. And the accuracy in most of them, I would say not all of them, but the ones that have published research shows that it's actually really good. It's probably almost equivalent to some of the bigger, fancier pieces of equipment. And the nice part then is you get a daily measurement that takes just a few minutes. Because if you're training, you have other stressors you're doing, maybe you want to do a 7-day fast or whatever, do some crazy stuff like Logan's doing, just start slow. You can then see how your stress level is changing from day to day. And that to me is the most useful because a one time point measure of stress, even if it's the morning, not that useful. But now can I see how it changes each day? Oh, I did something different with my nutrition. Oh, I did some different training. Now it becomes useful to try to help figure out what's going on with how your body is responding to all the different things that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. This just popped in my mind. Are you aware of any research correlating this to the stress hormone cortisol in the body?
There is some. The hard part is that they don't line up quite as neat. because they're looking at stress response, but a little bit different. So cortisol is, in my opinion, a little bit more of a long-term-ish management of stress, right? So if we all of a sudden walk through the woods and we see a bear, yeah, by all means, cortisol is definitely going to go up and then it'll come down. But most of the changes that we're going to see immediately are modified by the nervous system itself.
Right.
So related to heart rate variability, we'll see that the parasympathetic side, the kind of quote unquote rest and digest branch of the autonomic nervous system, that will actually go and change very fast. And then we'll have the sympathetic portion of the nervous system, the stress kind of fight or flight. And that will also change very fast too. So I tell people it's like having a brake and the gas pedal on your car. I push down harder on the brake. That's more parasympathetic activation. The car is going to slow down, right? More rest and digest. If I jam harder on the gas, it's going to be fight or flight, and that's going to make the car go faster, but the engine's going to be under more stress. So there is associations between cortisol and HRV. Most of the time, acutely, they'll look at specific nerve trafficking. They'll take a tiny needle, which I've had done, which is not a lot of fun, and they jam it in one of the nerves, and they actually listen to the nerve traffic. And then they can do different things like maybe put you on a tilt table and tilt you up and down and do different things and monitor HRV at the same time and see how they are kind of correlated to that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So
my last comment on that too is that a lot of people get mad at me for talking about HRV and then they're off doing like 4-point cortisol tests all the time. I'm like, wait a minute. Yeah, I don't know how much a saliva cortisol test is associated with things. I think it's an okay marker and gets you in the ballpark. But even if it is 100% dead nuts accurate, you're still talking like $100 to $400 a test. Like, how often are you really going to be able to do that? You know, I can give you an app on your phone that costs very little to almost free. Now you can do it daily and see how things are changing, which to me is a lot more interesting than just these single point measures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it speeds up the feedback loop because you can do that rather than like once a quarter.
Yeah.
Once a month, you can do it every single day, which is important.
Yeah, it'd be like learning, right? It'd be like, hey, go squat, and I'm going to tell you how your form looks like 4 months from now. Oh, okay. That sounds like a horrible idea.
Right.
Or I can pay a coach to tell me on each rep how I'm doing. Hey, that sounds better if I'm going to learn.
Yeah. I mean, are you familiar with the concept from like Chinese medicine or Ayurveda, the pulse diagnostics?
What exactly is that?
They're holding different points which would correspond to the different meridians and being able to feel the difference in the pulse on those points and how that would map to things. I was just thinking about it. So it's like the most simplified version would be just counting the pulse, right? Which is something doctors do. But now our science is getting to these things. We can measure heart rate variability, and I'm not sure, I don't know a whole lot about this subject and certainly not a master at it by any sense of the word, because that's a very deep thing. But yeah, being able to feel these different things. So it's interesting to see if our technology continues to kind of map more of those things that ancient Chinese masters have been doing for millennia.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something to it at a high degree, right? I mean, if you want to go back in time and look at the history of HRV, just look up history of heart rate variability. The main author is Billman, Billman. He does a really good summary of just the principles and everything. And my guess is that people probably figured this out hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. Like I said, there's some data to support that. And that they were probably feeling variability. They may not have known what it was as a concept, though. So in theory, you can feel differences in variability possibly, and that can be a marker for stress. There's some old thing called the Zacoca pulse test, I think, was by a chiropractor from the 60s or 70s, maybe. I might have got that wrong. That said that to try to pick up food allergies and different things, to eat a specific food and then measure if your heart rate went up or down. I haven't seen any data that's said that is a useful thing or not. Because now you get into the thing of, well, let's say I did that, and let's say I use heart rate variability. If I became a little bit more stressed or less stressed, is that quote unquote good or bad, right? I could do a biopsy of my right bicep after I did a bunch of curls and look at the muscle fiber and go, oh my God, that's horrible. Never do that again. Like the muscle's completely destroyed. Or I could do it, 4 days after it's healed and like, oh, wow, it's a little bit better. So I think that's where it gets messy to try to determine, is that something that is useful or not? And again, we always want to say it's, good or bad, but physiology is kind of dynamic. So it depends upon when does it happen and what is kind of the long-term outcome of that.
Yeah, this is where the terms eustress and distress can be useful.
Correct.
There are some things that are just plain bad, like if I whack you in the head with a hammer, that's not really good. I mean, there's a healing response and maybe it will come back a bit stronger to be able to protect from that, but not so much. Like, it's not a useful thing. Whereas doing any sort of exercise, you're stressing the body in order for that to trigger adaptation, to trigger mechanisms within the living body to come back stronger from it. So yeah, it's a very good point there. And we know with our food, like there's a whole thing about, you shouldn't eat lectins in food now, people talking about this. And yeah, there may be some cases where you should be avoiding or cutting down on these, but we also see that these are the like plant stressors that go in our body and stress things in order to make our body better adapt and come back healthier from doing so.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Is that I'm going to butcher this, but was it a xenohormetic response? I think there's something like that. Yeah, there's actually a technical term for it. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I like the concept of eustress and distress. To me, that's most useful. And yeah, I mean, if all things are being equal, I would say a marker of health is to have the most amount of metabolic flexibility you could. Mm-hmm. All things being equal. They had this robot a while ago called Eater, and it was an autonomous scavenging robot that could use all sorts of different things for fuel. To me, that's kind of the apex of what humans should be. Like, I can eat red meat and I'm fine. I can go eat some of these lectins, I'm fine. Right? You should be able to eat a wide variety of things and still be okay. Mm-hmm. Again, that doesn't mean I'm only going to survive on ginger root extract the rest of my life or whatever. People get kind of crazy with one particular thing, but having a good variety of different things, we get different beneficial compounds from them. And then ideally having your response from them be pretty good, right? Mm-hmm. You can handle fats pretty good. You can handle a long fast and you do good. You can handle eating 2 bowls of white rice and you don't end up passed out in an insulin-induced stupor under your table. That doesn't mean you want to do all of those things all the time, though. And that's where people get stuck.
Right. So adaptability. I like the term anti-fragility because I think it really
that's my favorite word with that.
Yeah.
Right, because you're getting better with stress, right? I can drop a Tupperware bowl on the kitchen floor and it'll bounce around and not break, but it didn't get better from that impact. Right. Mm-hmm. So a lot of physiologic living systems like humans, I go to the gym and I do exercise, and initially we measure you like maybe the next day, you're actually a little bit worse. But I give you a couple of days and you recover, and then you're actually a little bit better. So you actually became better because of that appropriate amount of stress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the very first episode of this podcast, I was defining health. Most people think of it as the absence of disease, and I don't think that's a very good definition. Instead, it's the great anti-fragility or great adaptability to stressors. And I did a thought experiment a while back of what would ideal health actually look like, and a whole bunch of things. Like, of course, you need to get like all the micronutrients the person needs and whatnot, but this person wouldn't be lacking in stress. They'd actually be under a whole bunch of different stressors, but with the ability to handle those stressors and come back better from them, in which case they'd actually be getting better over time, not worse.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. When I do presentations, I show a picture of, have you ever seen a huge vehicle called the Unimog?
No, I don't think I have.
I show a picture of it next to a Land Rover, and it dwarfs the Land Rover. And a Land Rover is not a small vehicle. It's, it's much bigger than a, Hummer or H2. And I believe they used them towards the end of World War II. So I actually got to hang out and found one when we were in Baja. And like, I'm standing next to it and the top of the tire is just under my armpit. This is a huge vehicle. But they use it for a lot of, races in Baja and across the desert because it has super high clearance of suspension and it has all these things to literally absorb and handle a massive amount of stress. So I always think of physiology as similar. What amounts of stress can you take on and sort of absorb and get back to baseline or homeostasis faster? I would agree that to me is a much better marker of health. And indirectly, we have all these markers that are literally that. Well, what is heart rate recovery? Hey, let's stress the piss out of you with exercise and see how fast your heart rate gets back down to baseline. Oh, what's an oral glucose tolerance test? Oh, let's give you 80 grams of glucose and see how high you go and how fast you get back down to baseline without going hypoglycemic on the other end, right? What is performance? How fast can you change directions, whether that's sprint, change a direction in a football game, change the direction of a heavy deadlift off of the floor, right? So we have all these kind of indirect, I would say, markers of that concept already.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And of course, there's many of them because the human body is very adaptable and can try a lot of different things out.
Definitely.
So with the heart rate variability, just to kind of close the loop on idea there.
Sure.
So if you're observing that every day and making changes, just because you have, let's say, less variability the next day, then that doesn't necessarily mean that thing's bad. It means you're more stressed. So that could be stressed in a good way versus a bad way. So for instance, the exercise thing, once again, the next day, if it was a really hard workout, you'd probably have a lot less heart rate variability. That's not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. You have to look at the trends over time.
Yeah, and that's where people go kind of awry and get, like recently there's a bunch of people who have their undies in a bunch because HRV in research wasn't necessarily absolutely predictive of acute performance or even over a short multi-week training study. Again, one of the studies did show they got to the same result by using HRV versus not using HRV. And I won't go down that whole rabbit hole. But all you have when you look at HRV is a measure of stress only on the autonomic nervous system. I would argue the autonomic nervous system, if you want to measure one thing for stress, that's a really good thing to measure because it controls a lot of stuff in the body. But it's, like you mentioned, even with cortisol, it's not absolutely everything. All right, so a lot of people are obsessed with, hey, what is the one metric that can predict performance? It's probably performance, right? I mean, vertical jump can get you close in some stuff for reactive strength, things of that nature. But non-performance metrics, we know they're a real thing, but the physiology is not quite that simple. Like fatigue is a multifaceted thing. And everyone like listening to this knows this, right? How many people listening to this have gotten up one day, you're like, man, I don't feel very good. I'm supposed to go to the gym today and do heavy deadlifts. You get there, you kind of get through your warm-ups, and you're like, I'm feeling a little bit better. Holy shit, you pull like a 10-pound PR out of like nowhere, right? It happens. It's probably not going to happen all of the time, but you're not going to do that every single day, right? I can take my little Jetta and drive to Cub Foods and redline it, and I can get there faster, but I'm not going to be expected to do that every day and expect that the engine's going to last, 250,000 miles. So there's always a cost somewhere associated with it. And what you said is also true. There may be some days where I want to see a worse, quote unquote, HRV score the next day, right? I'm maybe trying to reach something that's a little bit higher. So I need to impose enough stress that it may take me 24, 48, 72 hours or longer to get back to baseline from that stress. Again, that's not inherently a bad thing. However, if I don't realize that and I don't know that, and I try to repeat that thing again 3 days later, I may get away with it, but if I do that enough, it's not going to be quite so good. So to me, my little quote-unquote golden rule of HRV is it's only telling you the status of your autonomic nervous system at that point in time when you measure it, which is normally first thing in the morning is the measurement. Right. And to me, that's still super useful, right? Because I can see how much stress my body is under. The hard part is it could be from a whole bunch of different things. It could be from poor nutrition. It could be had an accident and your dog unfortunately died the day before. You got an argument with your spouse. Your training was harder than you expected. Right? It could be a lot of different things. All of those are going to provoke a pretty big stress response. And so that's the tricky part about HRV is kind of trying to figure out what are kind of the main things, what are some of the main drivers. And then I use that to kind of auto-regulate performance long-term because I can look to see, okay, if let's say their lifestyle is good, not much is going on there, if we just simplify it, and I really start pushing them hard on training, like the first kind of cycle I do with new clients is I just push them by adding more volume each week until they tell me that they hate life and their HRV goes in the tank. Because within one cycle, I have a really good idea of about how much volume and how much stress their body can handle. And again, this is done in an intelligent manner. I don't want huge load spikes or anything like that. But some people get up to doing 5, 6, 7 sets, a trainings a day, maybe training 5 to 6 days per week. Most people aren't nearly close to that high. But by looking at HRV, that gives me an idea because I'm getting that response of their specific physiology. So I have some data to know, okay, getting kind of close here, might kind of go over the edge there. And then I'll actually use that. So if I'm programming, say, for a power lifter to peak for a big meet, we may take then, 9 or 10 weeks, push all the volume up super high. Ideally, we want to see HRV starting to tank maybe 2 weeks out. And then I'll run a very long taper to make sure we have enough time to kind of resolve all of that stress so that they have a little bit of super compensation on the day that they're being tested.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. I have a question with HRV. I imagine you've been doing this for yourself for quite a long time. Can you do it without measuring it? Like, do you pretty much know where you're at?
What's funny is I've been trying to do that for years. So I've been doing my own HRV for daily for 7 years. I mean, I've literally probably only missed a handful of days, and people are like, hey, you dumbass, don't you know anything about your own body? Why the F are you still measuring HRV? And the answer is most of the time I'm pretty close. But I stole this quote from Simon, who runs iAthlete, and I agree with him. 10 to 20% of the time, I'm not even close at all. And the thing that people forget is that some stressors are unconscious.
Right.
So for example, I recently was down in South Padre, Texas. We drove down, did a bunch of kiteboarding, was super fun, stayed in a slightly different place. And my HRV was the highest it's ever been before we left. Even traveling down, everything was looking great. And I get there, I go out and ride. It was super cold out, but not a big deal. And then the next day, every day I took my HRV for literally the next 9 days. It just was on this roller coaster, headed downhill. And I'm like, what the hell? I'm playing with different things with sleep and recovery and training and, trying to figure it out. And it still kept going down. I'm like, this is so weird. So at the end, I was left with, I wonder if it's from kiteboarding and trying to do jumps and just, massive amount of neurologic input to your eyeballs and vestibular and that kind of stuff. We've changed almost everything else we can. We stayed in a place that had 2 open bedrooms. I'm like, let's just try the other bed for just the hell of it. Boom, the next day it goes up 8 points. What? Try it again. Next day it goes up 8 points. So again, maybe it's all negative associations with one bed versus the other. Maybe it was one had a kind of like a foam mattress on it, which does tend to accumulate a lot more heat and things like that. I don't know. But within 2 days, I felt way better for some odd reason. So if I hadn't been doing HRV, what I found in the past was I would tend to just bury myself in a hole because I'm like, that kid, you're feeling off today. There's no reason you should be off. Just train harder, you pussy. Where if I look at the number and go, okay, this is a lot lower than normal. I feel a little off today. There's probably something going on. I don't need to necessarily figure out what it is right away, but I know, okay, I'm just going to do some easy cardio today. I'm going to move my strength training until tomorrow, right? So yeah, it's been interesting. I'd say most of the time I'm pretty close, but there's some days where I'm super far off.
Interesting. I wonder if that's
interesting and maddening at the same point.
Yeah. The next 7 years, maybe you'll be able to dial it in a little bit further, but yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. It's I don't know. And then I go to the whole thought process of do I want to be conscious of all the stress I'm under? I don't think so.
Right.
That doesn't sound like a good solution either. So yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really good point. We aren't aware of all this stress. I talk about EMFs. Sure, there seems to be those hypersensitive people that can notice things, and some of them may be crazy as well. But the average person doesn't. But that doesn't mean it's not affecting them, down to a cellular level. That can be causing things that's going on. So there's all kinds of hidden dangers or stressors out there that may be having an impact. Who knows what was up with that bed that could have possibly been it, and it could have been something else and not even related to the bed.
Totally. Yeah, totally. It's the old analogy of a buddy of mine tells a story of the barking dogs in the room. Right? The dog doesn't know why he got locked in the room. He just keeps barking. And one day the door opens, the owner lets him out. So now he just goes, well, every time I bark, then if I get stuck in a room, the door will open. Right? Just a simple association. And, I have a couple of friends who are kind of very proud of how sensitive they are to things. And I'm like, that's interesting if I need a human guinea pig detector for stuff, assuming you're accurate. But man, as a way, if I wanted to live my life, I don't want to be that sensitive to stuff. That sounds like you're kind of went a little too far in the wrong direction in my bias.
Being a canary in the coal mine has its drawbacks.
Yeah, dead canaries.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's so much more we could discuss here, but we're coming up at the end time here. Where would you like people to go if they like what they heard today and want to check out more about you?
Yeah, so best place is probably just the website, which is miketnelson.com, MIKETNELSON. At the top of the main page there, there'll be a way to get on the newsletter, which is free. Most of my content, similar to Logan, goes out over the newsletter. So that's where you'll be able to find most of it. I've got articles, a bunch of other stuff on the site. And I do have a certification for people, especially trainers, who are looking for nutrition and recovery aspects. You can find that at flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. There'll be a way you can get on the wait list and on the newsletter there. Usually we release that. Right now we've been doing about like quarterly per year. So it's kind of a mashup of metabolic flexibility and flexible dieting along with a bunch of other stuff. So those would be the two best places.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And like I said, Mike has a new podcast, so you want to mention that as well? Not another fitness podcast?
Yeah, not another fitness podcast. I had a little podcast like contest, and I had a lot of like really good ideas, but I was like, oh, that one kind of makes sense because that's the reason I didn't do it for a long time. But there's little daily ones or semi-daily, kind of shorter concepts that are 5 to 15, maybe 16 minutes long, and then we'll be having a few more interviews probably coming out, next year if we can get a few more funds. And eventually I'd like to get to the point where I can, go out and, fly out and visit people and hang out with them in person and, get some good info that way too. But yeah, we'll see where it goes. But right now it's just mostly, pure information as another way of trying to get better, like yourself, information out into the world, make it a better place.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for joining me today. I hope everyone enjoyed this. And as always, love to hear your feedback.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.